Hello and welcome to Washington Exec's video series. I'm Amanda Ziadeh with Washington Exec, and with me today is Kristi Rogers. She's a managing partner of Principal to Principal. Thank you so much for joining me today, Kristi.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda, for having me. This is great.
Of course. So, Principal to Principal recently released its Global Supply Chain Task Force Phase 1 report and recommendations. I want to start by asking if you can tell us a little bit about what this Phase 1 report is and some highlights from the report.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking and thanks for your interest in this. As we all know, the COVID pandemic highlighted some systemic weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our global supply chains, specifically for critical goods. And early last year, when we were recognizing this, specifically for everything that we all know and felt, masks, toilet paper, and ventilators, it was very serious. We started having a conversation with some of our contacts on the Hill in Congress. And specifically, now Chairman Peters, Senator Peters, who chairs the Senate Homeland Security Committee, and his ranking member, Senator Portman, we were talking to their teams about, what can we do now to help? What can some of our principal to principal member companies can do to help in the supply chain crisis? And some of our member companies are companies such as 3M, Johnson & Johnson, Siemens Government Technology, who were really involved right in the thick of things. And so we went back and we talked to our companies and they said, yeah, would be willing to help. What do you want us to do? So we created this task force and it turned into quite the project. We've got two globally renowned academic experts with us. It's Professor Ravi Anyupindi from the University of Michigan and Professor Sue Helper from Case Western Reserve University in Ohio, who was just appointed to the White House Council of Economic Advisors for Supply Chain Management. So we're thrilled about that. So what we did is we spent a year in communication with the Senate Homeland Security Committee, but really talking to folks inside government, trying to identify current vulnerabilities and problems, and also talking to a lot of companies that were members of Principal to Principal, and then also outside. U.S. companies that operate globally. We talked to hospital systems, both public and private, and trying to figure out or try to identify what some of the obstacles are, and then try to recommend some immediate solutions, and then some solutions that would help both from a national security perspective and economic security perspective going forward and strengthening our global supply chains. So we came up with this report. We issued it last month. Again, it was specifically focused on the global supply chains for PPE, personally protected equipment, pharmaceuticals, and other medical equipment. And we identified 3 umbrella recommendations with some action items underneath. But the first thing it's important to understand is this wasn't just a COVID pandemic problem. It didn't just heighten or highlight vulnerabilities that just popped up in the global supply chain. It took years for weaknesses and these vulnerabilities to sort of seed themselves in our global supply chains. Our American manufacturing and supply chains have been really hollowed out over the past few decades due to several different factors. And what do I mean by hollowed out? A lot of supply chains, American company supply chains, have been forced overseas. Forced overseas because of lower cost overseas, less regulation, an easier tax structure, and also access to workforce. So we took that into account when we were going through all of our assessments and our interviews and coming up with our recommendations. So if I could just real briefly talk about the 3 recommendations, and then I can turn it back over to you, Amanda, for a question.
Yeah,
but our 3 umbrella recommendations. First, we think it's imperative that one organization inside the federal government plan, prepare for, coordinate, and respond to national disasters. The pandemic really, again, highlighted some gaps in the U.S. response, preparedness, and coordination sort of system. Several of our member companies, including those that were making masks and ventilators, said that they were receiving numerous different requests from numerous different agencies inside the federal government. For example, one company received a request from Health and Human Services asking for X amount of masks or other PPE to go to a certain location. And then FEMA, or the Department of Homeland Security, called them almost the same day and said, hey, we need X amount of masks to go to a different location, both immediately. And they weren't talking to each other. So we think it's imperative, first and foremost, and I know this sounds very simple, to have one organization plan, prepare for, coordinate, and respond to national disasters. And you would think that's the Department of Homeland Security, but there really needs to be an organization inside. We call it the National Response Preparedness Coordination Center within the Department of Homeland Security. And we think that will truly help in coordinate a whole of nation response. And what I mean by that, not just the federal government, but when the federal government needs something from the private sector, who is willing to stand up? We had so many companies raise their hands and say, hey, we want to volunteer to help. How do we do so? So we think by having this one consolidated entity, it will better communicate to the private sector. It will help in develop the preparedness and response plans. Our second umbrella sort of recommendation is we call for establishing a National Supply Chain Institute within the Department of Commerce. I'm not one personally, and members of our task force really have said this. We don't typically advocate for bigger government and more government. However, in today's age, it is really important that we actually have a supply chain institute inside the federal government that can increase visibility of our global supply chains, primarily of critical goods, and continuously monitor them, identify where some vulnerabilities are, and coordinate and communicate back and forth with the Department of Homeland Security on an ongoing basis, not just in times of crisis. And then also work with the private sector and sponsor research techniques to better improve technology and how we actually go about our supply chains. A lot of talk has been, you've heard about reshoring or pulling supply chains back to the US. In some instances, that might make sense. In many instances, it doesn't. But do we need to regionalize or maybe move some of our supply chains to allied nations? Probably. As the pandemic highlighted, so many of our critical goods are actually manufactured in non-allied nations, China, for example. And when a crisis happens, that's just not a favorable or ideal situation. So our second umbrella recommendation is to create a supply chain institute inside the Department of Commerce. And then our third umbrella recommendation really is really comprehensive. And we're saying that the federal government needs to tap American innovation and ingenuity to dramatically strengthen our supply chains, dramatically strengthen its surge capacity, and also the resiliency of our supply chains. So we come up with numerous recommendations on how to integrate advanced manufacturing, next generation solutions for surge capacity, stockpiling, and also training or retraining of the workforce. Those are all very critical. And I'll just give you an example of what I mean by some advanced manufacturing or some specific action items we recommend. One we recommend is a digital twin exchange and the Digital Strategic National Stockpile program to help integrate advanced manufacturing into our strategic national stockpile. This would dramatically speed up the time to produce critical goods and also dramatically reduce cost in the long run. So that's just one example, but those are our three sort of umbrella recommendations in our report. And that's phase one. And phase one was focused on sort of PPE, again, pharmaceutical and medical equipment.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing those three recommendations with us.
I know it was a lot.
It's very helpful. And I also understand Principal to Principal took these recommendations and briefed the Senate Homeland Security Committee and the White House Council of Economic Advisors. How is this report being used to improve the national and global supply chain from that perspective? What are the next steps really after briefing them?
Well, that's the important part, isn't it, Amanda? I mean, how many reports and plans are sitting on desks collecting dust? Right. So one of the things that we've said as a task force is that we are going to see this through to implementation. It is imperative for our national and economic security that we get this right. And so many of our previous national disasters were making the same mistakes. and it's time we learn from them. So we are in regular communication with the Senate Homeland Security Committee, the House Homeland Security Committee, and also other committees. We've worked with Senator Young and Majority Leader Senator Schumer on their bill called Endless Frontier Act. And we actually have some language to create the Supply Chain Institute in the Department of Commerce in that bill. So we'll see. So we are working all angles. We are working with any elected member, Republican and Democrat, that wants to improve this system and wants to improve our response for the next time. And that's really important. It's like, they can say, well, what are the lessons learned from this pandemic? Well, we're not making some recommendations to help fix, what went wrong in COVID. We are making these recommendations to fix the system for the next crisis. And we also continue having conversations with the Department of Commerce and then also the Council on White House Economic Advisors. It's fortuitous that one of our experts was appointed to the White House Council of Economic Advisors as their supply chain expert. So that was great.
Yeah, definitely. And like you mentioned, this is just phase one. I understand you're launching phase two as well soon, within the next couple of weeks or so, and it's called Emerging Technologies, Semiconductors, Rare Earth Minerals, Made in China 2025 Products. So tell us a bit about this phase, what's going to be inside the report and the information that could be used.
Well, we're going to take the same tack as we did sort of phase one. A lot of interviews, a lot of conversations, working with academic experts and also the private sector. And everyone, it's in, when you turn on the TV, you can't avoid it. Semiconductors shortage, supply chain shortage. When you read the papers, it's a headline every day, and members of Congress are talking about it. I'm sure, Amanda, you guys are seeing, AT&T just did a policy forum yesterday on supply chain of semiconductors. What we're trying to do is we're very thankful and we think it's very good that all these different organizations are doing that, but we want to make this long lasting and long term. So our phase two, which is, as she said, emerging and advanced technologies, semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and made in China 2025 products, is a lot. But it's going to be at least a year-long project. And the task force, we've had some encouragement that we want, or people want it to be turned into a coalition. So it can be long-term. And that we can actually we being the members, which are private sector and public sector, sort of keep a watchful eye to make certain that the United States is for its national and economic security doing what we need to do to secure our supply chains and make them resilient. It's not just for national security, but it's also for the benefit of our economy. So you'll see recommendations that are very similar to, because they're supply chains, right? So a supply chain is a supply chain in some instances as phase one. But we are really going to also try to do some, as we go through the process, to make some real-time recommendations, because the crisis is now, especially for semiconductors. And I'll give you an example. We actually have a roundtable coming up in the first week of June with the ambassadors of Japan, South Korea, and Australia to talk about the semiconductor supply chain shortage and some things we can do. So it's going to be a very active, sort of longer-term project.
Gotcha. So how can companies participate if they're interested in joining this process?
We want everyone to participate. So honestly, and it's the more the better. We are looking for expertise, both academic and from private sector standpoint, small, medium, and large. We have on next Wednesday, May 26th, we are doing a virtual forum, only 30 minutes to actually go in depth about this for anybody who is interested. And if you are interested, our Chief of Staff, Laura Valentine, can be contacted. Her email is laura@principal2principal.us. So she can be contacted for details. It's going to be, I think, via Zoom or some other, virtual forum. And that's probably the best way to do it, or we can be emailed. And our emails are very easy. Mine is Kristi@principal2principal.us.
Perfect. Yeah, easy enough. Well, thank you so much for sharing the highlights of phase one with us. We look forward to seeing phase two. I appreciate you being here.
Excellent, Amanda. Thank you so much. Have a great day.